William Lyon Mackenzie was born on March 12, 1795 in Scotland. His mother Elizabeth was a 45-year-old widow who raised him alone. Mackenzie entered a parish grammar school at Dundee at age 5 and then moved on to a Mr. Addy's school. By 1810, he was writing for a local newspaper. Mackenzie's mother arranged for him to be an apprentice with a tradesman in Dundee, but in 1814 he secured financial backing from Edward Leslie to open a general store and circulating library. During this period, Mackenzie had a relationship with Isabel Reed, whom gave birth to Mackenzie's illegitimate son on July 17, 1814. The boy was raised by Mackenzie's mother. During the recession that followed the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Mackenzie's store in Dundee went bankrupt and he traveled to seek work in 1818 for a canal company. He traveled briefly to France and then worked briefly for a newspaper in London. Lacking stable employment at the age of 25, Mackenzie emigrated to British North America with John Leslie. Mackenzie initially found a job working on the Lachlan Canal in Lower Canada, then wrote for the Montreal Herald. Mackenzie began to write for the York Observer. In 1822, Elizabeth Mackenzie moved to Upper Canada. Elizabeth brought along a young woman, Isabel Baxter, whom she had chosen to marry her son. The couple were married on July 1, 1822 in Montreal. Isabel had a remarkable 14 children with her husband. In 1814, Mackenzie established his most famous newspaper, the Colonial Advocate. It was initially established to influence voters in the elections for the 9th Parliament of Upper Canada. Mackenzie supported some characteristically British institutions, notably the British Empire and the clergy reserves, but he also praised American institutions in the paper. The Colonial Advocate had financial difficulties, and in November of 1824, Mackenzie relocated the paper to York. There he advocated in favor of the reform cause and became an outspoken critic of the family compact, an upper-class clique which dominated the government of Upper Canada. However, the newspaper continued to face financial pressures and faced stiff competition from another reform newspaper, the Canadian Freeman. As a result, Mackenzie had to suspend publishing the Colonial Advocate from July to December 1825. He purchased a new printing press in the fall and resumed publication in 1826, now engaging in even more attacks on leading Tories. However, Mackenzie continued to amass debts, and in May 1826 he fled across the American border to Lewiston, New York to evade his creditors. A mob of 11 young Tories thinly disguised themselves as indigenous peoples of the Americas broke into the Colonial Advocate's office in broad daylight, smashed the printing press, and threw the type into Lake Ontario. Mackenzie took full advantage of the incident, returning to York and suing the perpetrators in a sensational trial. Mackenzie took advantage of the money and fame which the trial had brought him to re-establish his business on sound financial footing. Mackenzie declared his intentions to run in the elections for the 10th Parliament of Upper Canada and entered into correspondence with reformers. Running in York County, Mackenzie was one of 4 reformers vying for York County's 2 seats. Mackenzie's tactics were successful, and he and Jesse Ketchum won the seats as part of a landslide that saw the reformers win a majority of the seats. Mackenzie now had a prominent position from which to advocate for further reforms in the colony. He organized committees on agriculture, commerce, and the post office. He was also critical of the Bank of Upper Canada, which was a monopoly and a limited liability company. Later in the session, he also spoke out against the Welland Canal Company, denouncing his close links with the Executive Council. In 1829, Mackenzie traveled to the U.S. to study the new president, Andrew Jackson. He admired the small size of the American government, the spoil system, and Jackson's opposition to the Second Bank of the United States, which corresponded to Mackenzie's feelings towards the Bank of Upper Canada. Mackenzie was also impressed with Jackson personally when they met. Following Mackenzie's 1829 trip to the U.S., his political attitude became increasingly pro-American and anti-British. The 10th Parliament was dissolved in 1830 following the death of King George IV, and fresh elections were called. Unfortunately for Mackenzie and the reformers, the mood of Upper Canada had changed somewhat from 1828. Consequently, the 1830 election saw the reformers win only 20 of the 51 seats in the 11th Parliament. Disappointed at the setbacks to the reform movement, Mackenzie became something of a troublemaker. Meanwhile, the 11th Parliament met in January 1831, and Mackenzie continued to denounce abuses in the province. He chaired a committee which recommended increased representation for Upper Canadian towns, a single day's vote, and voting by ballot instead of voice. In a legislative session that opened in November 1831, Mackenzie demanded investigations of the Bank of Upper Canada, the Welland Canal, King's College, the revenues, and the chaplain's salary. Taking his language a step further, in the Colonial Advocate, he denounced the Legislative Assembly as a sycophantic office. This was too much for the Assembly, and in December of 1831, they voted to expel Mackenzie. On the day the Assembly voted to expel him, a mob of several hundred stormed the Assembly, demanded that it dissolve, and called for fresh elections. The Assembly refused, but on January 2, 1832, Mackenzie won the by-election called to replace him by a vote of 119 to 1. The elections took place at the Red Lion Hotel, and when his victory was announced, a parade of 134 sleighs paraded down Yonge Street, accompanied with bagpipes, celebrated the occasion. Nevertheless, on January 7, 1832, Mackenzie was expelled from the Assembly on the basis of new attacks Mackenzie had published in the Colonial Advocate. A second by-election was called, and Mackenzie won by a landslide for a second time. The year 1832 was a time of great political turmoil in Upper Canada. On March 23rd, riots broke out in York. Later in the day, following the riots, Mackenzie went into hiding. In April 1832, Mackenzie traveled to England to petition the British government for redress. In London, he wrote in the Morning Chronicle to influence British public opinion in his favor. Mackenzie remained in London for some time. He also wrote a book during this period, Sketches of Canada and the United States, designed to acquaint the British public with his grievances. The township of York was incorporated as a city on March 6, 1834, taking the name of the City of Toronto, to distinguish it from New York City in the USA, and the dozen other settlements named York in Upper Canada. The Tories and the Reformers fielded candidates for Toronto's first municipal election, held on March 27, 1834, with the Reformers winning a majority of the Toronto City Council. Mackenzie was elected as an alderman. The city council then met to decide who should become mayor. Mackenzie, after being nominated, defeated John Rolfe in the vote and thereby became the first mayor of Toronto. Mackenzie was largely ineffectual as a mayor. He got rid of Tory officials and replaced them with his supporters, but did not manage to deal with the city's excessive debt or institute much needed public works. Rather, Mackenzie's management style provoked frequent quarrels on the city council. In the wake of his electoral defeat, Mackenzie founded a new newspaper, The Constitution, which symbolically had its first issue printed on July 4th, 1836. In the pages of the Constitution, Mackenzie began advocating constitutional change for Upper Canada. In July 1837, just after the death of King William IV, Mackenzie began organizing a constitutional convention. Delegates would be selected by reform associations from around the province. Mackenzie's ultimate aims were made clear when he began to reprint Thomas Paine's revolutionary tract, Common Sense, in his Constitution newspaper. Mackenzie now approached John Rolfe and Thomas David Morrison with false information that people outside Toronto were prepared to march on the city to organize a revolt. Rolfe and Morrison were still not entirely convinced. Mackenzie called a meeting of reform leaders outside the city and convinced them that, together with the support of Rolfe Morrison and some dissatisfied members of the Family Compact, they would be able to take control of the government. He then returned to Toronto and informed Rolfe and Morrison that the revolt would begin on December 7th. Rolfe and Morrison were angry that Mackenzie had deceived them, but ultimately decided to go along with Mackenzie's plans. On November 24th, Mackenzie traveled north of Toronto to rally supporters. At a meeting on December 2nd in Stouffville, Mackenzie set forth his plan for rebellion in greatest details. Mackenzie felt that given an armed demonstration, the Tories would be overwhelmed and there would be no need to actually use violence. The rebels were instructed to assemble at John Montgomery's Tavern on Yonge Street on December 7th and then march into Toronto together. On December 1st, Mackenzie wrote a Declaration of Independence, which was to be distributed to rebels immediately before the march on Toronto. On Sunday, December 3rd, Mackenzie returned to Toronto, where he learned that John Rolfe had sent a message to Samuel Lount, instructing him to raise several hundred men and enter Toronto the next day. Mackenzie attempted to stop this action, but he could not reach Lount in time, and thus the Upper Canadian Rebellion began ahead of Mackenzie's planned schedule on December 4th. By the evening of Monday, December 4th, the first of Lount's troops had begun arriving at Montgomery's Tavern. Mackenzie determined that he should lead a scouting expedition to determine Toronto's preparedness. On the way, he was met by Toronto Alderman John Powell, who had been sent to investigate rumors of unrest north of the city. Powell managed to kill one of Mackenzie's men and then escaped back to Toronto, where he warned the government of an impending rebellion. On Tuesday, December 5th, Mackenzie grew increasingly erratic. On Wednesday, December 6th, new arrivals replaced the men who had gone home, but Mackenzie did not attempt to march the men on Toronto, and they simply sat around at Montgomery's Tavern. Mackenzie's only action that day was seizing a small mail coach bound for Toronto. On Thursday, December 7th, the day initially set for the rebellion, 1,000 troops quickly recruited from loyal areas of the province, led by Colonel Allan McNabb, marched on Montgomery's Tavern. In the ensuing Battle of Montgomery's Tavern, Mackenzie's troop quickly surrendered after McNabb opened artillery fire. The rebel leaders escaped to the United States of America, with Mackenzie arriving in Buffalo, New York on December 11, 1837. On December 13th, he declared himself the head of a provisional government entitled the Republic of Canada. Several hundred volunteers traveled to Navy Island in the next few weeks, as did shipments of food, arms, and cannon shot. Recruitment was hurt, however, when the American government, headed by President Martin Van Buren, instructed the volunteers that they would be prosecuted as criminals if they participated in the planned invasion. On December 29th, Canadian volunteers led by Colonel Allan McNabb bombarded Navy Island, while British troops led by Captain Andrew Drew of the Royal Navy cut loose the American ship SS Caroline from its moorings and set it alight, as it had been supplying Navy Island. While this was going on, Mackenzie had traveled to Buffalo seeking medical attention for his sick wife. While there, he was arrested for violating American neutrality laws, but was released on bail and returned to Navy Island in January. With the collapse of his Navy Island scheme, Mackenzie settled in New York City in January 1838, with his family joining him in April. In May, he launched a new newspaper, Mackenzie's Gazette, which was initially successful because the rebellions of 1837 had created American interest in Canadian affairs. In January 1839, he moved to Rochester, New York. Mackenzie was now determined to settle permanently in the United States. For the first time ever, Mackenzie now editorialized on internal American politics. He denounced Martin Van Buren as a tool of British imperialism. The trial for Mackenzie's violation of American neutrality laws in January 1838 was finally held in June 1839. Mackenzie was sentenced to pay a $10 fine and spend 18 months in jail. President Van Buren was initially reluctant to pardon Mackenzie because he did not want to offend the British, but he eventually was pardoned. Mackenzie became an American citizen in May 1843. In 1846, Mackenzie published a highly critical biography of Martin Van Buren, whom Mackenzie despised. In March 1849, Mackenzie reached Toronto. Rumors spread, and as the evening set in, intoxicated men began to assemble in front of the property until several hundred of Torontonians had gathered. Despite a police presence, the mob attacked the home, throwing bricks and rocks. There were no injuries, and by 4 o'clock in the morning, the mob left. The next night, another mob gathered, but they targeted an unpatrolled Bay and Bond streets, smashing gas lamps and windows. Mackenzie immediately went on a cross-country tour from Montreal to Niagara Falls, noting that he was happy to be allowed to visit. But by April 1850, his desire to return to Canada was too great, and he moved back to Toronto in May. Mackenzie took advantage of his notoriety to resume a career in politics. He ran in a by-election for the seat of Hunterdon County in the 3rd Parliament of the Province of Canada. He won the election, defeating George Brown, the owner of the Toronto Globe. For the next several years, Mackenzie was the loudest advocate in the Assembly for the cause of true reform. This involved the resumption of several of his political stances from the 1830s. He now also became an opponent of government overspending and was especially critical of state aid for railways, especially when those railways were monopolies. He repeatedly introduced a simplified legal code which he had drafted but was never passed the Assembly. As at many points in his life, Mackenzie continued to suffer financial difficulties. With his health failing and his confidence in the reform movement gone, Mackenzie resigned his seat in the Legislative Assembly in August 1858. Mackenzie died on August 28, 1861, following an epileptic seizure. He died at his home in which he lived since 1858 at 82 Bond Street in Toronto, and was buried at Toronto Necropolis.